Perfect. Yeah. Yes, and I love it how it sounds. I enjoyed hearing you talking in French. Unfortunately, I don't speak French, but we'll try to make this session work. So, hi again. My name is Paola Delgado, and I worked for SBTi for many years, and now I have my own consultancy, and we have been partnering with the UN Global Compact for the last 3 years. To deliver these sessions. So please, by all means, ask all your questions. Feel free to type them in the chat while I present a few slides just as an introduction, and we can respond them in the Q&A section. So if you allow me, I will start showing my screen. Let me still do that.
You had a water stewardship program in China.
Okay, perfect.
Great, perfect. So I'll just do a brief introduction because you have obviously been, doing this training and you started with GSG accounting. You probably have already concluded the self-learning modules. And this is really just a recap and also some updates on the initiative. But as a recap, basically the initiative has 3 main standards. 2 are for corporates and 2, well, there's another one for financial institutions. The ones for corporates, they are for the near-term criteria or near-term targets. So those are targets that run 5 to 10 years into the future. And then there's a net zero standard that also covers long-term target setting, plus the neutralization phase once a company has achieved those long-term targets. And then there's a financial institutions standard as well for near-term targets. And the initiative is currently working on the net zero standard for financial institutions. Now, the last thing that you can see on the screen is not a new standard or a different standard. It's just a different route that was developed for SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to make it easier path or easier entry for them. And I'll talk more about it in a moment. And just a frequently asked question about how near-term targets are connected to long-term targets under the net zero umbrella. Well, basically, they follow the same pathway, the 1.5 degree decarbonization pathway. There really tries to be, the initiative tries to make these targets connect to each other and align in terms of the annual emission reductions that companies need to achieve in the near term and the long term. So when a company is committing to net zero, it will have to set near-term targets, so 5 to 10 years into the future, long-term targets, which are deep decarbonization targets to reach a residual level of emissions by no later than 2050. It could be earlier if the company is prepared to, it could be 2040, 2045, etc., but at no later than 2050. And then the third element that is compulsory when you set a net zero target is to commit to neutralization of residual emissions. So once you have achieved the long-term target, let's say by 2050, for example, you might not have eliminated all sources of greenhouse gases. And that's how you would need to commit to a neutralization of those emissions that you will still be emitting thereafter. So you have to neutralize them in the date of the target year of your long-term target, but also thereafter to be able to claim that your company has achieved net zero. So the neutralization part refers to basically capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and permanently storing it. There is not much guidance that SBTi has provided, but it's looking into it. And you can see as well here, number 3, which is only recommended. It's not compulsory, but it's strongly recommended for leading companies. So in your path to reaching net zero, companies are encouraged to also, invest or make actions or projects that are outside of your value chain. So basically outside of your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, and to help others decarbonize, right? Like to help society transition to net zero quicker, right? To give also to increase the likelihood that we will reach that important milestone. I'll
Thank
talk
you.
more about, yeah.
Sorry, Paola. Thank you for this right now. I just want to make sure that everyone is okay with the English. Just to make sure everyone is comfortable. Est-ce que tout le monde comprend bien? Est-ce que tout le monde a une bonne compréhension de Paola?
De mon côté, c'est bon.
Oui, c'est bon.
C'est c'est pas rapide, donc c'est bon.
Ok, super. Si vous éprouvez des difficultés à un moment de comprendre, n'hésitez pas à lever la main ou alors il y a aussi l'option de sous-titres que vous pouvez avoir aussi sur la session. Donc vraiment, n'hésitez pas aussi à m'envoyer un message si vous avez une question ou quoi que ce soit.
Marche, merci.
Voilà, merci. Thank you, Paola. I give you the lead again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to go, in a good pace or not too fast. But this slide is really important because it really summarizes what companies have to do. And of course, this will be in cycles, right? You may set first a target that runs 5 years into the future. But then once you have achieved that target, you have to continue setting, other near-term targets until you get to the level of emissions that we need to be at by the latest 2050, right? So just to continue with this slide, I want to mention that SBTi has done a good job in summarizing the changes to its resources and its criteria from year to year. So every year the initiative reviews its criteria, its resources. Sometimes it just does very little changes and just for clarification. Sometimes there are major changes. And so you can consult this document that is called Main Changes Document. And it's a good tool if you have been exploring, the resources for a long time and you want to know what changed. Because it's important to mention that when you're ready to submit for validation, you must be able to use, the most recent resources. So for example, there was a corporate manual that was retired, and now all of its content has been moved to the corporate net zero standard or the procedure for validation of science-based targets. There's also a new glossary, and there were some changes to the submission form and the tools and the net zero tools. These are the resources that I would strongly recommend for you to review when you are preparing for validation. Basically, this procedure for validation of SBTi targets, it's the guide to, understand how SBTi implements the criteria or reviews the criteria during validation. The SBTi criteria assessment indicators document will basically outline all of the criteria in all of the standards and will tell you what is the minimum to pass that criterion and also what evidence you need to submit to be validated, right? And then the last one is just the corporate target submission form that also has substantially changed over time. And so it's basically the form that you will have to fill out and submit to get validated, right? So all these three documents work together So when you're preparing for your target validation, I would recommend you to really follow what is here to ensure success. There's also something that is going on at the moment that is a big project, actually. It's the review of the corporate net zero standard. So basically, this standard was, I think, launched in 2020 by the SBTi. It started being developed in 2018. But now, with many things that are going on and new science, etc., there's a need to review again the corporate net zero standard. It's a big project because it's expected to last all this year and also next year. So the final deliverable will be for Q4 2025. And it has four main goals. The first one is to align with the latest science, like the IPCC 6 assessment report. The second one is to address challenges related to scope 3. Because net zero requires deep decarbonization, not only of scope 1 and 2, but also of scope 3, it's important to tackle this issue, right? Because if companies want to claim that they have also reduced their value chain emissions, it has to be done in a credible way. And there are many challenges associated with scope 3 accounting, with reporting progress against scope 3, etc. Just another note on scope 3. There's currently a discussion paper around scope 3 challenges and a proposal from SBTi on how to tackle those challenges. So maybe if Fernanda can help me post it in the chat, but I would recommend you to read it. It's a good discussion paper. So hopefully, it will become a little bit clearer and easier for companies to set these targets. It will continue to integrate improvement from companies. So what this refers to is basically companies are having challenges to demonstrate their progress on a yearly basis. SBTi is developing a monitoring, reporting, and verification standard or protocol. And there was also a call for evidence last year on the use of environmental attribute certificates that you may have seen, and that is currently in discussion in the SBTi. And finally, to improve the structure of the standard and enhance the interoperability with other frameworks. So I think this is an important heads up if you're thinking about setting net zero targets. It will be reviewed during this year and next year. Just to mention about the beyond value chain mitigation guidance. So SBTi released these two documents this year. The first one is really a guide for companies to design and implement these beyond value chain mitigation strategies, right? Like how can companies support others in the decarbonization trajectory, right? How can we accelerate decarbonization to make sure we do not lock in and we continue to reduce emissions at the pace needed? The second one is barriers and incentives for the private sector to adopt beyond value chain mitigation. In some cases, it just makes sense to also do this extra because it will eventually also benefit the company and in general society, right? Like with more resilient value chains, maybe also part of this report indicates that there is a need to invest in technologies that are at the stage of, scaling up and that they need more investment now. For example, carbon removal technologies. Every company will need, or most companies will need carbon removal. So it makes sense to help with R&D, research and development, for example, invest in that. So yeah, very interesting reports as well. I would recommend to read them. I think I have a few slides left before we move to the Q&A, but this is just a reminder that when you set near-term targets and long-term targets, there are a few differences in the requirements. For instance, when you set near-term targets, the ambition for scope 1 and 2 has to be 1.5 degrees already, while for scope 3, there's still flexibility to align your near-term scope 3 targets with well below 2 degrees. However, in the long term, companies have to also set the ambition for scope 3 in line with 1.5 degrees. With respect to the boundary, there's also a difference for scope 3. In the near term, companies only have to set scope 3 targets if those emissions are more than 40% of the total emissions. And if that's the case, they at least have to cover 60%, 67% of scope 3 emissions in a scope 3 target or targets. However, in the long term, that ambition has to be ramped up, and basically the coverage of scope 3 has to be at least 90%. The final difference or main difference is that there's a list of eligible methods for near-term targets and long-term targets. All of these methods are embedded in SBTi tools. However, there's a particular one, which is the number 4, supplier or customer engagement, that's more a target that is eligible for near term and not for the long term. Why? Because the expectation is that companies start now engaging their suppliers, for example, and bring them along in this decarbonization journey. There's no time to waste. We need also value chains or supply chains to follow. And that's why in the long term, this target might be too late, right? So that's why it's only eligible for the near term. Okay, so I explained that there are a few main standards in the SBTi. However, there is also sector guidance. And here you can see a summary of all the sector guidance that has been developed or is being developed, right? That is planned. I would just like to emphasize that when you're preparing for setting your targets and validating them, it's important to review this guidance because there are sometimes some sector guidance is optional, but sometimes there is sector criteria. So that means that it's compulsory. So if your company falls under one of these sectors, it's important that you review as well the developed guidance. And just to mention that, for example, the latest sector launch last month was buildings. SBTi has now a new buildings guidance. There are a few interesting things to mention. For example, that it covers in-use operational emissions. So all those emissions that occur when a building is being operated, but also it covers upfront embodied emissions. That means when the building is being built, it covers the emissions from the materials and it covers the emissions from the construction. There is some guidance on who can use this guidance and who should be using other more generic guidance in the SBTi. Also, companies and financial institutions must commit to no new fossil fuel installations and to halve emissions by 2030 at the latest. So yeah, I would also recommend you to read that if you fall under any of those sectors. And finally, just to explain a little bit the SME route, I mentioned that this is a simplified validation route for small and medium enterprises. The definition has changed. Before, the definition of an SME for SBTi was a company with less than 500 employees that was not a subsidiary. However, there's much more detail now. You have to check that none of these statements are true and check that 2 or more of these statements are true, right? So for example, if your company emits more than 10,000 tons of CO2 in scope 1 and scope 2, you cannot use this route, right? And all of these have to be true. Yeah, so I think I'll keep it short here, and you can have the slides as well. And just to mention that the SME route is different because basically the targets are already predetermined, and the SME would choose which target it wants to commit to, right? It still has to have a GHG inventory as a basis. For the near term, it doesn't have to set a scope 3 target, but commit to measuring scope 3 emissions and reducing them. But if the SME also wants to set net zero targets, in that case, it also has to cover scope 3 emissions under a target. So that's basically the difference. It's also cheaper because it's a more streamlined route, and the cost is different from the normal validation cost. So I think that was all that I had just as a recap, and happy to answer any questions.
I have a question concerning transport. Do you know when the standard will be available for transport sector or road transport?
Yeah, it's a good question, because currently, so the land transportation, I believe you're talking about land transportation, right?
Yes, totally correct. Yes.
Yeah, because there's also the aviation sector guidance and the maritime sector guidance. But for land, it's outdated. It was developed some years ago. I was actually part of that development team. And the reason it needs to be updated is to use the most recent mobility model from the International Energy Agency. I can't recall what is the timeline that SBTi has established for this process. I don't know if also, Fernanda, you can help in the chat to link there to the SBTi website. However, the current guidance is that companies can use in the land transportation can use the generic methods for now. So for example, the absolute contraction. And if you have land transportation emissions in your scope 3, you could use the land tools that are available because those are still aligned with well below 2 degrees. So, and in the near term, well below 2 degrees is still allowed. So that's currently the guidance.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah, and there's a question from Christine of why SBTi never take bill and carbon add them into account. It's a good question. I think the answer is just as simple that the SBTi uses the greenhouse gas protocol as the basis for all its criteria and standards. And so when a company is using another accounting system, it has to make sure that when they submit for validation, they do, maybe the company has to move some emissions around in the scopes to make sure that it's consistent with the GHG protocol. So yeah, and also the GHG protocol is currently going through a major revision of its standards. And the expectation is that next year there will be a new or refreshed standards for the GHG protocol.
I have a question. In the power sector, we are expecting to have new standards, sector specific, in particular for renewables as well. So I work in the renewable sector. And what happens if we submit our targets before the new specific sector guidance comes available?
Yeah, it's a good question. So basically, SBTi provides a grace period. So when a new method it's established, it will still for a period of time, the previous method or guidance will coexist with the new guidance, right? So if you're already in the process of getting validated, you will be validated with what was current the date that you submitted, right? Sometimes for some sectors, there is a need to bring all companies to alignment before the company has to review its targets, you know, because there's a requirement that once companies have set their targets, they review their targets every 5 years to align to the latest requirements or criteria. However, in the case of the flag sector, the forest land and agriculture sector, there was a need for companies to start measuring those emissions and to set targets by a certain date. I don't know if the SBTi will implement a similar rule for power generation because they are reviewing their guidance on power generation. And so we will just need to wait to see what would be the requirement. But again, usually they give a grace period for companies to start using the new guidance. And sometimes they grandfather companies that have set their targets with a previous method.
Okay, thank you, Paula. Because in practical terms, we committed early this year, and the new sector-specific guidance not expected to be available within the next 2-year period where we have to submit our targets. So, yeah, it's just to avoid doing double work.
I know. Yeah, I think that SBTi is aware of that, and the expectation is definitely that you use the guidance that is available now to not delay action. And whatever the rules are when they launch the new guidance, they will communicate before, you know, to companies so that they can prepare.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I see there's another question in the chat.
Ça, c'est Jean qui sait le livre. Comment on va.
Excusez-moi, monsieur Géraud, je crois qu'on entend votre son. Est-ce que vous pouvez couper votre micro si vous n'avez pas de questions? Merci beaucoup. Sorry, Paula.
Thank you. Yes, and the question is about the SMEs. Maybe I can quickly share again my screen. I know that I just briefly touched on this, but it's correct. The SME definition changed, and it started to be in effect on January 1st this year. So before it was like just 500 employees or less, and that it was not a subsidiary of another company. However, now companies have to make sure that they follow this eligibility criteria to be able to use the SME route, right? For example, if a company is classified as a financial institution or oil and gas sector, they cannot use the SME route. Or company owns or controls maritime transport vessels or power generation assets. Also, it cannot use the SME route. And then in this second box, 2 or more have to be true. So the company needs to be employing less than 250 people, have an annual turnover of less than 40 million euro, and total assets are less than 20 million euro, and it's not in a mandatory flag sector. So it is more complicated now to use the SME route. You have to make sure that you fulfill this eligibility criteria to be able to use it. But yeah, we can share the link to the SME FAQ, and anyways, you will have these slides. I believe there was someone with a hands up. I don't know if
Yeah, I just posted my question on the chat. It
okay.
was regarding also the SME criteria and about if a company is growing and is now eligible for the SME route, but is growing and may not fall under this category anymore in the following years. What changes and what does the company have to do?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I believe that question it's in the FAQ of SMEs that actually Fernanda just posted in the chat. If I remember correctly, you know, if there is like a slight change in the number of employees, you know, you don't have to worry. Every 5 years you have to revisit your target to make sure that it's still in alignment. So you can wait until the 5-year mark to then, you know, see what's next, if you can still be using the SME route or if you have to transit to the normal route. However, you know, if it's a substantial change, like suddenly you start acquiring a bunch of companies and then you grow exponentially in a very short time, maybe what is most recommendable is that you move to another to the normal validation route. But it should be there. Okay, I think Fernanda just copy pasted the answer.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm just yeah, I provided you the right answer. Just
Great,
checking.
thank you.
You're welcome. Sophia?
Yeah, I might have a question. While we are also on the process of submitting, we have committed to the SBTi and now we are developing our targets. Once we submit them, they are validated by the SBTi, if I understand right. Every 5 years we have to track, they are controlled, or they will be controlled by the SBTi if we are on track with the targets. Because this is my question: how will it be tracked during all the period of 10 years for near-term targets to know that companies are on track, and what happens if companies are not on track?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what I was referring to with the 5-year checkpoints was mainly to check if your target is still valid and using the most, you know, recent criteria. However, I think your question is more about if you're progressing and achieving your targets, right? And currently, SBTi doesn't have any rules around having to meet the targets. There's no penalization. However, it is developing, as I mentioned before, monitoring, reporting, and verification guidance. So more to come in the future. I think that mainly what SBTi is requesting from companies now is that you report your progress against your targets on an annual basis and publicly. So either you report to CDP or you report your greenhouse gas inventory and your progress against your targets in your sustainability report or your website, whatever it is, but that is public. But the SBTi is not really doing anything with that. The only thing that the SBTi is doing is every year they are preparing and launching I think it's called the monitoring report, actually. And they try to measure the impact of the SBTi as a whole and they do dig into the company's public reporting and try to assess the progress of companies, right? So they have been doing this, but there is really no penalization if a company is, you know, off track. Also because there is no prescription on how the company should be moving, right? Like even though the methods use an average annual reduction, it doesn't mean that, for example, the trajectory has to be linear, right? Like maybe some companies have to prepare a big project before they can start steeply decarbonizing, and then for the first years you stay, you know, flat. Or maybe some companies actually raise their emissions a little bit before starting to decrease. So there is no requirement on the trajectory. As long as you report that transparently of what is happening between one year and the other, and that's perfectly fine for now.
Okay, thank you. And there's just a reputational risk, because at the moment I think if you don't submit your targets in the 24-month deadline, you appear as commitment removed on the dashboard.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And now SBTi does publish removed commitments. So your name will still be there, but it will appear as removes for transparency.
Okay. And I have another question to the building guidance, because when it was still the pilot project, there were 3 criteria inside, and we were supposed to be concerned by this. But now I think they just let 20% of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions should be related to buildings. For me, it means heating, cooling, whatever. And is it correct if 20%
Yeah, let
heating,
me
cooling, lighting?
Yeah, the threshold you mean for determining whether you need to use buildings guidance or not,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay.
The criteria C3, I think.
Yeah, we do have that a slide on it. I'm just trying to quickly find it, or I don't know, Fernanda, if you find it first, just to double check that percentage. To be honest, I'm also still getting familiar with the new guidance. But yeah, maybe we can come back to that one if Fernanda finds
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
I just found it. I put it in the chat. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so 20%, you're correct.
Okay.
In full or set on in use operational emissions.
It's quite similar in France with what we call le décret tertiaire. Maybe that we have to decarbonize the buildings and building activities. Okay. Okay,
Great.
thank you very much.
Welcome. Henry?
Yes, if I understand you, if we report publicly our emission, even if we don't, if we are not on track, if we don't follow the decarbonization trajectory, if we report publicly our emission on the effort made, we won't be blacklisted.
That is correct. Like you wouldn't be like SBTi wouldn't make any communications about your company. And the reason is because there is no MRV protocol yet, and because there is no prescription on how fast you should be reducing year on year. As long as you make sure that by the target year, you get to the emissions levels that you targeted, that would be considered a target achievement. What happened in between, you know, those years, it's not prescribed by the initiative.
Okay, thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Joseph? Yeah, Joseph, do you want to come in?
Joseph, est-ce que vous nous entendez? Je ne crois pas qu'on vous entend. Je crois que on ne vous entend pas, mais votre micro est bien activé. Donc, est-ce que vous pourriez, je ne sais pas, je ne crois pas que on ne vous entende, mais vous nous entendez. Donc, est-ce que vous pourriez écrire votre question dans le chat si jamais c'est... Ah, technical issue. Okay. The question is in the chat.
Yeah, that's a good question too. No, it's not compulsory. You can, for example, decide to just start with near-term targets. You cannot do the other way around. You cannot start with only long-term targets. You always need near-term targets. But that could be a path for your company. You could start first with near-term targets, get them validated, understand more about the net zero standard, and maybe also this revision of the net zero standard that is going on this year and next year, and then wait to go through the validation of your long-term targets and that are part of this net zero standard, right? So that's a pathway that companies also can use. The alternative as well is to, from the beginning, submit near-term and long-term targets as part of the net zero commitment.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we can hear you. Perfect.
Oh, you can hear. Okay, so sorry, Paola, for the technical issue. So we can submit near-term targets only, and
Yes,
then afterwards in the future commit to long-term targets in addition to the previous, the initial objectives, right?
correct. Correct.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and thanks for the note, because if you're a company, like in general, like here in this group, if you're a company that has already validated near-term targets and you're looking into net zero and long-term targets, it's important to check that your near-term targets are still would still be eligible to be considered under this net zero package. I believe it's in the Getting Started guide, where there's a checklist to make sure that your near-term targets would be okay to then move to the long-term targets. So when you're ready to do that, you just need to make sure that also your near-term targets are still valid.
Okay, and maybe just a last question, please, Paola. So if I understand correctly, one of the starting points would be the SBTi tool, right? If we want to have an idea of maybe an estimated emissions reduction target for each year, we can use this SBTi tool to have like a kind of annual percentage applied to our emissions, right?
Correct. Like you could use a SBTi near-term target setting tool. And there's the absolute contraction approach, which is the cross-sector approach, right? It's sector agnostic. However, just to mention that what the tool will give you is your base year emissions, then the target year emissions, depending on which year you choose, the percentage reduction, and it will also give you a year-on-year reduction. But that's just like, as I was saying, that's just because the tool is using an average reduction rate. So it will give you a linear path, but it doesn't mean that you have to go in that linear path from your base year to your target year, right? That's just how like the tool calculates it. It's a reference for companies, but it doesn't mean that in between the base year and the target year, you have to follow that linear path. That's not the case.
Makes sense. Thank you for the insights. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I don't know who was next.
Yes, I have a question. Sorry, thank you for your presentation. I asked the question within the chat twice, but I didn't get answer.
Okay,
If we are
sorry.
a company that have a big growth in terms of turnover, and do some acquisition, that means very big growth, 2-digit per year. how did you manage SBTi target to have a reduction in absolute value that is not that is complicated for companies that don't have growth, but much more complicated for companies that have big growth?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's also a frequently asked question, but basically, and we're happy to also include some slides in the slide deck about it that we have prepared. But basically, if your company is growing organically, right, like you create, for example, you have new plants, etc., you would just, that is not triggering any recalculation of the target. However, if your company is growing inorganically, as you mentioned, like maybe through the acquisitions of new companies or mergers, in that case, the GHG protocol says that you can re-baseline or like adjust your base year, and that may trigger a recalculation of your established science-based target, right? So those are kind of like the two pathways, right? Like if you're growing organically, there's no need to do any adjustment. If you're growing inorganically, there might be the need to do some adjustment. Now, whether that's fair or not, that's another question. You know, like in general, what emission scenarios indicate is that emissions have to be decoupled from growth. And that's what SBTi is trying to promote. All of the methods and the tools in the SBTi will lead to an absolute reduction of emissions. And however, we understand that there are some challenges, right? Like the SBTi recognizes that there are some challenges to that growth, particularly for Scope 3 emissions. And there's a very good discussion in that document that I mentioned before, the Scope 3 discussion paper that the SBTi recently released. And that might change in the future. There might be some more flexibility on Scope 3. But I hope that answers your question.
Very clear. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Maybe we can take one more question.
Yes, I have also a question about calculation from year to year. If you notice that, especially in Scope 3 emissions, you forgot one part or you had to recalculate the values, then it may have a negative impact so that your Scope 3 emissions will be growing instead of decreasing. And it's not actually because we didn't try to reduce them, but because we noticed with maturities that we forgot something, for example. So how can we deal with this negative side of maturity improvement?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. I agree, right? Because in SBTi, basically, you're allowed to set a Scope 3 target with the data that you have that might be imperfect, might be very, you might have used economic input-output models that are subject to a lot of uncertainty. And over time, the expectations is that companies move to better quality data, right? And that they mature in their Scope 3 accounting. But that will definitely require some recalculations of also past year emissions, right? So that's why it's very important to always document what you do, which emission factors you use, which assumptions you used, to make sure that when you have new data, and perhaps indeed you realize that your past calculations were not accurate, or they could even be wrong for any reason, you need to do those adjustments and be transparent about it in your GHG inventory. That's what the GHG protocol talks about transparency, and that's perfectly fine. All companies go through this process. Of course, you need to make sure that also when you have Scope 3 targets and you are trying to demonstrate progress against Scope 3, you have two levers, right? You have the emissions intensity of the activity or the product, right? And that's like also subject to a lot of uncertainty of emission factors, etc. But you have also activity, right? Like you could also, for example, have improved logistics that will help you reduce the activity and then overall reduce scope 3. So it's important that you are transparent as well on how you're progressing, whether your mitigation action was related to choosing lower emission products or activities that would reduce your activity in scope 3, right? But it's normal, I would say. It's tough, but you, as long as you're transparent about it, that's perfectly fine. And SBTi also talks about this in the discussion paper that I still haven't finished reading. It's a long paper, but I would really recommend you to read about it. This is definitely a challenge for many companies.
Right. I have a question. I think that my hand is up since long, so if I can ask my question now. So I want to be long. My question have two aspects. The first aspect is about the threshold that you have used for the classification of the SME. I can see in the last diapo. And my next question is about the development or the actualization of the standard about the solar sector. Do you have something that is very specific to this domain, or is it included in energy and utilities too?
To your second question, no, there's no specific sector guidance for solar energy. It is all covered under the power generation sector. But there's no specific guidance about solar. To your first question, it was about SMEs, but I didn't get the question. Can you please repeat?
It's about the reference of classification. I mean, the threshold reference of classification, because I've seen that you have said that when we talk about the SMEs, it's under, I mean, 50 million, something like this. So I want to know the reference to
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can send you the slides, but all is in SBTi's website. I believe maybe if we haven't done that yet, if it's not in the chat, we can send it over afterwards, after the session, where you can read more about these requirements. There's also an FAQ for SMEs only. And I think that's it. I think probably there are just 2 documents around the SME route. So happy to share them.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you for the question. Okay, well, I'll hand it over to you, Melly.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I think we have one last question in the chat from Caroline Shaw. I think it was, do you know when to expect the chemical standards to be out?
That's an excellent question. I don't know all the timelines, but I would say that the reference is the SBTi website. They're under the sector tab. Like if you go to what is it? Sectors, standards and guidance sectors, and there's chemicals. Probably we can find more information there. But yeah, happy to also look into it. I'll just copy paste the link here and see if you could find it as well.
Yes, perfect. Pour les participants, si
I think they just finished creating the expert advisory group. It says from May to June 14, 2024, the SBTi called for experts. So yes, so yeah. So they're still setting up everything for commencing this project development.
Okay, get it. Est-ce que cela répond à votre question, Caroline? Thank you. C'est ce qui a été marqué. Parfait. Well, thank you, Paola. Si vous avez d'autres questions qui vous viennent à l'esprit, n'hésitez pas à me l'envoyer et je la transmettrai à Paola. If there is further questions, I will send it to you, Paola, after the session.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll leave you here, but thank you so much for your great questions and best of luck. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paola.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.